So welcome to the Beef Cattle Research Council's webinar on economics of pregnancy detection. My name is Stacy Domlewski. I'm the Extension Assistant for the Beef Cattle Research Council, and I'll be your moderator tonight. This session is going to last for approximately 1 hour, but may go a little longer depending on how many questions you have during the question and answer period at the end. If you're on Twitter, please tweet along with us using hashtag BeefWebinar. We are recording this session tonight, and I'll email you a link to the recording along with everybody else who is registered within a couple of days. So if you miss hearing anything tonight and want to watch it again later, you can. I would also encourage you to take some notes as well that you can look up later, and it'll also help you remember a bit more of what you learned tonight. Of course, for tonight's webinar, you'll be able to hear and see our presenters, but we can't hear or see you. So if you want to communicate with us, type into the small chat window in the control panel on the side of your screen. If you have any questions or comments, please, that's where you put them, and then we'll answer your questions at the end of the hour. If your internet connection is a bit slow tonight, it might help to close the webcam window. This means you won't be able to see us, but it'll hopefully make your audio come through a little better and get the slides to load a bit faster. All right, so let's get started. Here's what we'll be covering tonight. We'll start with Reynold Bergen giving speaking on the value of industry investments in research. We'll then turn it over to Jessica Gordon to talk about different methods of pregnancy detection, and then turn it over to Brenna Grant to discuss the economics of pregnancy testing. We'll give you guys some time for questions and then end with some closing remarks. So with that, let's get started. I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Reynold Bergen. Reynold is a science director at the Beef Cattle Research Council. In a nutshell, his job is to communicate research to beef producers and explain beef producers to researchers. You may know him from his weekly or monthly column he writes for the Canadian Cattlemen's Magazine. So with that, take it away, Reynold.
Okay, can you see what you need to see?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay, thanks. I'm Reynold Bergen. I'm the Science Director for the Beef Cattle Research Council. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the BCRC and why it's important that industry invest in beef research. So the BCRC is Canada's largest not-for-profit industry funder of cattle, forage, and beef research. And we fund R&D and tech transfer initiatives that'll help to improve the competitiveness and sustainability of Canada's beef industry. Now, all of the funds that the BCRC invests are producer dollars, and so it's producers who decide how those dollars are invested. And the producers who sit on the Beef Cattle Research Council are appointed by their provincial beef groups, and the number of producer reps that each province or region has on the BCRC is proportional to the number of national checkoff dollars that region allocates to the BCRC. So as I indicated, the BCRC is funded by the national checkoff, and that national checkoff is used to support two things. One of them is marketing and promotion through Canada Beef, both in Canada and internationally. And the other activity is research and innovation, which is primarily through us at the BCRC. Now, each provincial beef group not only sends representatives to the BCRC, but they also decide how that national checkoff dollar gets split between research and marketing. So of the provinces that contribute to the BCRC, those allocations range from 7 cents in Manitoba up to 30 cents in Saskatchewan, and on average across the country that works out to 18 cents of the dollar that is currently being allocated to the BCRC. So this is a pie chart of what it is that the BCRC is investing in. And so if we start at the very top right, where the green slice is, and work our way around clockwise, we'll see where the dollars are going. So currently about 27% of our funds are going towards forage and grassland research, 24% towards feed grains and feed efficiency, 22% towards animal health and welfare, 13% towards food safety, 7% towards beef quality. This thin little white sliver is environmental research. That's very likely that slice is going to get a lot larger in the coming years. And actually, we're currently funding our first specifically environment-focused research project now, and that's determining how the environmental footprint of Canada's beef production has changed over the years. And the first results of that project have been really, really exciting, and we're actually going to be having a webinar focused on that on November 17th, so you'll want to tune into that. Also, tech transfer and extension is this purple slice here. That's 6% of our research funding is going towards that. And that's what's producing things like our beefresearch.ca website and all of the topic pages and research results and blog posts and videos and stuff that we have there, and webinars like this. And what we're trying to do through this is to bridge that gap between science and production so that the research results from universities or provincial or federal researchers become innovations that benefit producers in the field. So that's how the BCRC is putting where we're putting producer checkoff dollars. But one of the really, really important things about these industry funds is that they can attract other funders as well. So for instance, we're able to match each of our industry dollars with 3 government dollars through the beef science cluster. And that makes this pie a lot bigger. It makes it 4 times bigger. And that lets us get a lot more research done. And through the beef science cluster, we're currently administering $20 million in total. That's mostly from National Checkoff, plus some other industry funders, as well as mostly Ag Canada, as well as some other government funders over the current 5-year period. And we're currently in the initial planning stages for the next 5-year period, starting in 2018. So that's the BCRC in a nutshell, and with that, I'll turn it back over to Stacy so that you can finally get to listen to what it is that you signed up for. So thanks for listening.
All right, thanks, Reynold. So if anybody has any questions for Reynold, you can type them into the chat box on the side of your screen, and he'll answer them at the end of the hour during the question and answer period. So next we have Dr. Jessica Gordon. She's an assistant professor at the Ontario Veterinary College, where her focus is teaching beef health and management. This year, Jessica is also one of the researchers involved in our Beef Researcher Mentorship Program, a program that pairs beef researchers with beef industry mentors. So with that, go ahead, Jessica.
Okay. Thanks, Stacy, for the introduction. Doing a webinar is a bit interesting because I'm used to talking to a room full of people who give immediate feedback, and now I'm just staring at my computer screen. So I guess that means if I tell terrible jokes, I can just assume that you all think they're hilarious. But it does definitely take a little bit of getting used to. So as Stacy mentioned, I'm a professor at the Ontario Veterinary College focused on ruminant health management, specifically beef. And I'm going to talk about pregnancy testing in beef, cows, and heifers. As soon as my computer will let me go to the next slide. There we go. So we're going to talk about why might you preg check your cows, what methods are available to you, and what method is right for your particular situation. And so Stacy is going to start a couple of poll questions for us just to get an idea of what demographics we have here in the group.
All right, so we'll start with the first poll question here. So you can just click on the side of the screen. Your answers won't be shown to everybody. It'll just be a general survey of which each one ranked. So if you select the following, how do you pregnancy check? So manual palpation, ultrasound, blood test, or you don't pregnancy check. So I'll give you guys just a couple more seconds here to get everybody's answers in. All right. So it looks like the majority are using manual palpation, about 53%, 21% ultrasound, and 26% say that they do not pregnancy test. So the next question here, for those, the 26% that said that you do not pregnancy check your cattle, is it because you don't have the time, you don't have the facility, it's not accurate, or it's too expensive, or other? So for anybody who says they didn't, or for people who haven't done it on some years, you can fill in this question as well. Once again, I'll give you a couple more seconds for everybody to get answers in. And so it looks like actually a large portion are for other reasons. 29% say it's too expensive, and the other 29% say it's not accurate. So go ahead, Jessica.
Okay, so that's really interesting that no one in the group is using the blood test, but not surprising that most people are palpating, and the reasons given are pretty much expected as well. So why might you choose to preg check, or why do you currently choose to preg check? And obviously the biggest thing you can gain from this is monitoring reproductive efficiency in the herd. So as you all know, on a beef farm, you're really looking at how many calves you wean per cows exposed to the bull. But if you're pregnancy checking, you can actually get a lot more information than that. So just because you don't reach your target for number of calves weaned per cows exposed to the bull, it's hard to determine exactly where that's coming from. So is it because cows aren't getting bred, they're not getting pregnant? Are they aborting, or are the calves not living, which obviously most people can tell that, but some of the other things are really challenging to tell without having that pregnancy diagnosis. It can certainly reduce your feeding costs of your cows if you're not feeding open cows, or you can target those cows for some other markets. And identify some disease issues as well. So sexually transmitted diseases we're mostly talking about here, but certainly other diseases are possible to identify on pregnancy exam as well. And then it can help show some nutritional issues too. So a poor pregnancy exam is not going to pinpoint to a specific nutritional issue, but being able to look at the cows and do your pregnancy exam and understand your management, your veterinarian can pinpoint you to the areas that you should potentially be looking for. Obviously, it helps determine the effectiveness of the bull, so whether it be your bull group or even a specific bull, if you have one bull out with one group of cows, you can tell exactly how many cows that, that bull actually bred. And so those are some of the reasons that we might choose to pregnancy check. And so what methods are available? So rectal palpation is by far the most widely available and most widely used, though rectal ultrasound is becoming much more common due to many reasons, but partially because of things like this apparatus here in the bottom corner of your screen, and this is a hands-free probe. So you actually insert this probe into the rectum instead of having to manually put your arm in, and so it reduces a lot of strain on the practitioner's part, and it can give you a lot of really good, accurate results and a bit more information than you can get on rectal palpation. And then finally, the blood test is a relatively new option that we have. There are many different blood tests developed for cattle, most of which have sort of questionable results, but there is one type of blood test that is quite accurate in cattle, especially if you use it in a particular manner, and so we'll talk about that tonight as well. So rectal palpation, what are we looking for? So we're directly palpating either the fetus. So you can see here in the diagram that we have the arm of the practitioner coming through the rectum and palpating, in this case, the head of a calf. Now, this is a quite long-term in gestation, and so that's quite easy to palpate the calf in that case. But depending on where we are in pregnancy, we can still palpate parts of the calf, whether that be head, feet, or sort of whatever comes in contact with our hand, starting from about 3 months gestation. Or we can palpate these little white spots here, and those are called the cotyledons, and that's the connection between the uterus and the fetal membranes. And so we can palpate those as bumps in the uterus, and those start coming, being palpable about 3 months gestation. Prior to that, we are either palpating for the calf, but prior to 2 months of gestation, we call it an amniotic vesicle, so we're basically palpating the fetus at that time. Or what we can do is called a membrane slip. So we actually grab the side of the uterus, just as if you have on a shirt and a coat. If you grab your coat, pinch a bit of your coat sleeve and sort of pull up until your shirt sleeve naturally slips away, that's what we're looking for in a membrane slip, and that can tell us that the animal is pregnant in those animals that are too early to palpate cotyledons or a piece of a calf. It is interesting to note that you can actually palpate the amniotic vesicle all the way from the beginning of when palpation is useful. So the cost definitely varies by practice, but it averages approximately $5 a head. It really doesn't require any special equipment. Anyone can buy plastic sleeves and lube from your local farm store. However, the skill required takes a lot of time and practice to really be efficient and effective at it. So in the picture here, you can actually see one of my students palpating a beef cow a couple of falls ago. And here's a practitioner that's helping her. This is normally what producers look like as well, or maybe even a bit more scally when students are palpating, because it really takes a fair bit of time and they're really not very accurate when they start. So it takes palpating thousands of animals before the accuracy is quite good. And so that can definitely be a challenge depending on the skill of the practitioner, and it can, again, time-wise, it can take a lot of time if the skill is not high. It does require that you manipulate that uterus per rectum and correctly identify one of those positive signs of pregnancy that I mentioned. So accuracy varies greatly by practitioner and age of the fetus. So it can be up to 99% accurate. In cases where you're palpating longer in gestation, the accuracy definitely goes up, and practitioners that have palpated more animals, the accuracy definitely goes up there as well, but everyone can make mistakes no matter how seasoned the practitioner, for sure. The earliest detection of pregnancy by rectal palpation is generally about 35 days. So some of the pros of rectal palpation is that you get immediate results. So the practitioner is there, tells you pregnant or open, can age the calf, so tell you about how long in gestation that animal is, and that can help if you're going to choose to manage groups of cows differently. And again, it really doesn't require any special equipment. The cons is it does require quite extensive training and a lot of practice to be very accurate at it. You really can't determine calf sex, and there's really limited ability to determine how viable the fetus is. So as a fetus is getting ready to abort, you can feel the changes in the fetus or the amniotic vesicle, in that it just becomes a bit more squishy, and practitioners that are used to palpating animals can tell that relatively easily. However, you cannot see the actual heart rate, which we'll talk about with the ultrasound, and so you may palpate that animal before the breakdown of the fetus has begun, but the calf has actually died, and so that's definitely a possibility. Definitely lots of physical strain on the practitioner, and there's always the the chance for human error. And again, that varies greatly by practitioner. So on rectal ultrasound, what are we looking for? And that's going to vary a bit depending on how long an animal is bred. So this is a picture of a 35-day fetus here. And basically, it's the vet's job to look at this mess of gray and white and black and determine that there is actually a calf here. So if you're not familiar looking at ultrasound pictures, this black here is the fluid. And this white bit here is actually the calf. And so at 35 days, it doesn't look like much that's easily identifiable as a calf. Here's another picture of a calf here on the right that's just a bit further along. And so you can maybe start to imagine that there are bits of calf that you can identify. The thing about an ultrasound, which you can't see in this because it's a still picture, is that we can get a picture of the heart and we can actually see those valves moving, and we can look to make sure that the heart rate is good, that the heart seems to be functioning properly, and that helps us determine viability of that fetus. And then as the gestation goes on, then it becomes much more identifiable as a calf. So here in this far picture is a 60-day fetus, and you can see a head, and if you use a little imagination, you can see 4 limbs here. And this is a stage where practitioners who are skilled at it can actually examine just between the 2 rear legs and can identify with relatively good accuracy whether that animal is a heifer or a bull. And I am not one of those practitioners that's skilled at it, so I will not be able to tell you whether this is a heifer or a bull, but it is an option for some practitioners. Later in gestation, we're looking for those cotyledons, actually, the connection between the calf and the uterus, because it's really challenging to get the calf in a position where you can have a good look at it on ultrasound. And so we're looking for these white masses here, which are actually the cotyledons. And so the cost of this really varies greatly by practice. So it's going to be about $5 to $10 per head. So there are some practices that choose to use these arms-free probes. So here in the picture you see a vet coming out with the probe. That's this long white piece here. That's what's inserted into the rectum. You stick the ultrasound probe here into the end of this hands-free piece. And then you can see the cord connecting up to the ultrasound unit, and it's actually projecting a picture that's outside of this picture onto a TV screen. And so some vets feel that the use of this hands-free probe saves so much on wear and tear on their arm that they're willing to offer this for basically the same fee as rectal palpation. And they also feel that they can do this quicker than rectal palpation. And so that's advantageous for both parties. And then if you are wanting more information, so if you're wanting to sex those animals that are at the right stage of gestation, then generally practitioners will add a small fee on for that. It does require special equipment, so you have to have the ultrasound unit, which is fairly expensive, and then plus or minus this extension arm if the practitioner chooses to use that. And it does require the skill to be able to manipulate the uterus to get the image that you require, to be able to accurately read that ultrasound screen, to be able to determine if that animal is definitely pregnant or open. And the accuracy of this, again, varies greatly by practitioner. It does require a fair bit of practice to be able to master this skill as well, but can be upwards of 99% accurate because you're able to look for that fetal heartbeat, and because you can see exactly what's in the uterus, you get just a little bit more accuracy than you can with rectal palpation. And the earliest detection of pregnancy with an ultrasound is about 28 days. But again, the lowest range that you're going to get is going to vary greatly by practitioner as well. So you get immediate results. You can age calves and sex calves, and you can get a really good information about calf viability. So as soon as a calf starts to become unviable, again, we can see that the heart rate is missing, or if it's an animal that's its gestational age is a bit longer, that you can't necessarily get the heart in view, you can see changes in the fluid around the calf, and that comes quite quickly after pregnancy loss. And so in this picture, you can see one of my students using one of those hands-free probes to ultrasound a beef heifer last fall. The cons is it's generally the most expensive choice. Again, it requires extensive training and special equipment, and you still have the potential for human error there as well. And again, the potential for human error increases with decreased experience of the practitioner. So on the blood tests, what are we looking for? And again, there are many different types of blood tests that have been tried in cattle, but the picture, the box pictured here is sort of the most promising. So the bioprint test, and this test is looking for a specific protein that's associated with pregnancy. So pregnancy-specific protein B, interestingly named enough. And so as a practitioner, I'm not specifically obviously looking at the cow's blood and finding this protein, but it's run through a test kit that detects the protein. And so the cost is about $5 per head, but that's again going to vary greatly based on where you are, because it requires shipment to the lab, and it requires an appropriate needle and blood tube. So depending on where you source those things, you can actually get, from most labs that offer this test, you can get a full test kit from them that includes everything you need to do the testing, as well as shipping and then the cost of the test as well, so that it's going to vary a little bit depending on where you source those things and potentially how expensive it is to ship something from your location. And then the skill that's required is really the ability to collect blood from an animal, which is a much easier skill to learn than rectal palpation is, or rectal ultrasound for that matter. Because when you're collecting a blood sample, you can see exactly what you're doing, versus sticking your hand in a cow's rectum. It's sort of the great unknown in there. And as students often will say, oh, I'm feeling something, but I have no idea what it is. It's pretty obvious when you're taking a blood sample from the tail vein of a cow. You can see what you're doing. And so it's a relatively easy skill to master, and a lot of producers are able to master that skill on their own. And so they're able to collect that blood without the assistance of a veterinary or a technician. The accuracy of this test is about 99% for open cows and 93% for pregnant cows, which means that if the test says the cow is open, it's going to be right 99% of the time. And if the test says the cow is pregnant, then it's going to be right 93% of the time, which means 7% of the time it's going to be wrong. And why do we see those wrong values for the pregnant cows? And that's because the pregnancy protein that we're looking for in this test sticks around after fetal loss and sticks around after a previous calving. So if you're testing an animal within the first 3 months after the previous calving, they're still going to potentially have pregnancy hormone or pregnancy-specific protein B hanging around from the previous pregnancy. And if an animal just aborted or reabsorbed a fetus not long ago, they still are going to have this protein hanging around in the blood. The earliest detection for pregnancy with this test is also 28 days. So the pros, again, it doesn't require a vet or technician. The skill is quite easy to learn. There are actually videos on YouTube that can teach you how to blood test cows. It is less invasive, and it's likely the most cost effective if you have a small herd and you're far removed from a veterinarian. So veterinary farm calls can be quite expensive if you are in a remote area. And so this is a really good option for some of those producers. The cons is you cannot assess calf viability, sex, sex or age of calf. The test simply tells you pregnant or not pregnant. That's it. It can give you no more information. Again, you get false positives if your pregnancy loss or your previous calving occurs within 2 months. So that can be a huge issue if you're experiencing a lot of pregnancy loss. You can get a lot of false positives. So the test says that the animal is pregnant, but they're actually not. Results can take up to a week, so you have to collect the blood and then ship it, and then that requires some amount of time. Labs that do a lot of this will run this daily, but some labs will only run it once or twice a week. And so it can take a long period of time to get your results back. If you're hoping to make a decision on that animal immediately when the animal is in the chute, it's just not possible with this test. So it's going to require rehandling those animals to get rid of any open cows. And it doesn't give you any reason. It tells you that the cow is open and that's it. So there's no ability to determine if this is because of a bull issue, a cow issue, is it an infectious disease, is it nutritional? None of this information is provided. Certainly you can discuss the results with your veterinarian and they may be able to pinpoint some of those things for you, but nothing is given at the time of testing if you're taking the blood samples yourself. So really important to remember if you do choose to do pregnancy testing is that some fetal loss is actually normal. So loss between 30 and 60 days gestation is about 15%. So normally we're not checking beef cows prior to 60 days gestation in most of our management situations. But if you happen to be doing so, you can expect about 15% loss during that period. And between 60 days gestation and calving, you get about 2 to 4% pregnancy loss. And that's just normal biological variation. There can be some issue with the fetus. Potentially, sure, disease issues can come in there, but most of these issues are just either genetic incompatibilities or something specifically wrong with that fetus. And so we see that regardless. And so if you haven't been pregnancy testing and you start, and you're doing it early, you have to be prepared for some of those losses as well. And the earlier you check your cows, obviously the more loss is expected. So really, there are many reasons why you might choose to check your cows. Economics, ability to determine reproductive efficiency and look for disease risks on your farm. And there's many options, each with pros and cons. And the method that best suits your situation will really depend on the management of your herd, your geographic location, potentially even the year. Is it a drought year or not? This might affect what method you choose to use to pregnancy check your cattle. And so really you have to discuss with your veterinarian to really help you choose what's the most appropriate in your situation, what's going to give you the best bang for your buck. Oops. And the type of pregnancy testing you choose may actually vary from year to year or group to group on your farm. Again, if it's a year where there's the grass is really slow and you want to get rid of some open cows early, you might choose to use a different test than if you're going to just check them all when you bring the animals in for removal of the calves in the fall. So we'll answer all questions at the end, but you can see my contact information there at the bottom of the screen. So if you have any questions after the webinar, please feel free to give me an email.
All right, thank you very much, Jessica. That was great. So we will now actually launch one more poll question before we get going here. So the last poll question of the night is about when you sell your cull cows. So is it in the fall after weaning, after a short 90 days after feeding, or in the spring after calving, or other? All right, and we'll just give you a couple more seconds for everybody to get their answers in. All right. So we'll just show the results. So in the fall after weaning is the most common time. It looks like 20% are doing at other times of the year. 15% say after a short 90 days of feed, and in the spring after calving is about 10%. So with that, I am going to turn it over to our next presenter. So Brenna Grant is the manager at Canfax Research Services, where she is responsible for providing industry with statistical information, economic analysis, and market outlooks, focusing on both the Canadian and global beef markets.
Well, hello everybody. Stacy, can you see me?
I can see you. I can't see your presentation.
You can't?
Yes.
Why can't you? Show my screen?
There we go. Fantastic. We can see your
It's all
whole
the little, oh, okay. And it's all the little buttons that I forget about.
Yes, there's a lot of them.
Yes. So the Western Cow-Calf Survey reported that conception rates for all females was 93% in 2013, and this was down from 95.5% in the Alberta survey done in 1998. And this means we have more open cows than we had 15 years ago. And cull cows make up between 15 and 30% of a cow-calf producer's income, depending on his management style. And this means that the management of cull cows is not an insignificant aspect of a producer's income. And each year, a producer is faced with the decision to prig check or not, and this can really make an impact on the bottom line. According to the Western Cow-Calf Survey, 60% of Western producers do prig check. It may just be their heifers, or it may be their entire herd, and that's up 10% from 1998. There are a number of factors, and Jessica mentioned a couple of them. Historically, when we've talked about the economics of pregnancy checking, people talk about the savings from winter feeding that you don't want to be paying for as being the biggest one. But the value of a cow in a cow-calf producer's operation is dependent on a number of parameters, some of which are actually within the control of the cow-calf producer, and that includes his type of winter feeding management and the length of the feeding period. Conversely, you've got things outside of your control, namely the price of cows as well as the price of feed. So conventional advice has been that open cows should be sold after prig checking to avoid winter feeding costs. And you have also the ability to evaluate bull fertility and the identification of a calving date, potentially, depending on the method. But is it really worth it? And over the last 10 years, it really hasn't been, and that's sort of the sneak preview. And the reason for that is because after we had those BSE lows, we've been seeing not just that seasonal price increase from your fall low to your spring high, which is usually the advantage of keeping your cows over the winter, but we've also been seeing year-over-year price increases each year, and this means that you have definitely an added advantage to keeping those cows longer. But we have seen prices peak in 2015. We're actually seeing prices coming down, and the question then becomes, does prig checking now become economically viable? So cow-calf producers generally have three options for open cows. First is prig checking and culling directly after in the fall. This has the benefits for the producer of providing cash flow and minimizing additional overhead costs associated with keeping those animals over the winter. The second option is short-term feeding. And so you're still going to prig check, and you're then going to take those open cows and separate them and feed them potentially on a high energy ration to add some pounds to them. And this means that you not only get a higher price when you're out of those fall low prices, but you also get added pounds sold. And usually this feeding period is around 90 days. And the third option is overwintering those cows. So you're not going to preg check, you're going to winter all of your cows, and then the next spring after you've finished calving, you say, okay, these cows are open and you're going to sell them then. The economics of preg checking are really dependent on the cow market price, and so we're going to talk a little bit about price seasonality, as well as some of these bull and bear market changes and the implications on that price, but also the winter management system. This is really going to impact what your yardage is, as well as your feed costs, and that winter management system is also going to have implications on what your average daily gain is and the final weight of those animals. And this is going to play a role on how much of an advantage or disadvantage you have of keeping those cows over the winter. And veterinary costs, this has been one that's been brought up in the literature quite a bit, but we found when we looked at the model that it's a really minor aspect of the equation. And I want to say thank you to Elad Ben Ezra and Alexandra Muzzins, who were MBA students last year and actually developed the preg checking model that we're going to be talking about tonight. And so they looked at all of these factors and looked at 3 different management systems specifically. So what does the model look like? The model uses the control of not preg checking, and so everything is compared of if you're assuming you're not preg checking and you're keeping your cows over the winter to sell them in the spring. And so compared to that, you've got your full culling option, and your economic gains are the fact that you avoid your winter feeding costs and you have that immediate value of those open cows when they're sold in the fall. So you've got the cash flow. You have the economic costs of preg checking, so the vet cost, as well as the additional value of those cows in the spring is foregone. And then if you're going to do a short-term feeding scenario, your economic gain is that you have the additional value from the cull cows in the spring, and you're going to have both potentially a higher price as well as more pounds to sell. And then you've got the costs being your overwintering costs, supplemental feed, your vet costs, as well as that value of the cow and the cash flow in the fall being foregone. So this is just basic review. What are we talking about when we talk about that seasonality? Whether we're talking about coming down from the 2015 high back in May of 2015 to that fall low in November, or we're talking about that 5-year average, which is obviously not as dramatic, but we still see a November low and a spring high in early April. And the incentive to retain your cows until spring is really going to depend on the condition of your cows in the fall. If they're fat from being on grass all summer and there's very little potential of additional weight gain over the winter, you're maybe not going to see much benefit because you're really only gaining that seasonal price variation. Whereas if your cows are a little bit on the thin side, and by feeding them some additional days, you're going to have both the price increase as well as potentially moving those cows from a D3 to a D1 or a D2. You're not going to just have the additional pounds sold. You're also going to have the seasonal price increase as well as the difference in quality grades. And D3s are usually discounted by about 10 to 12 cents per pound compared to D1s and 2s in that January through May time period. And so adding those additional pounds can be beneficial on thin cows, remembering that you want those cows to be in a condition that they can go to market and by that they're sound. Then we've got our winter feeding. In Western Canada, average cost of production for a cow ranges really widely depending on your type of winter feeding management practices. It can be anywhere from $1 to $1.80 per day. And so this is going from a dry lot traditional confined winter feeding system right through to swath grazing and bale grazing. And over a 160-day feeding period, producers can save anywhere between $155 and $240 per open cow identified in colt. And obviously producers who are in an area where they're feeding longer, say 180 days, they're going to have larger gains. And if you've got a period where you don't have to winter feed as long, you're going to have smaller gains and therefore obviously smaller costs of winter feeding as well. Your total winter feeding costs are largely determined by that cost of feed, which accounts for about 60%. And our first conclusion of the night is that the higher a producer's feed and overwintering costs, the more favorable preg checking and culling cows in the fall is. But this can be offset by what the performance is of those cows. And here we've got 3 different ways of winter feeding. So the light blue one with the diamonds is dry lot, your traditional feeding, and then your dark blue circles is bale grazing, and then your gray triangles are swath grazing. And what this is showing is that if you have an average daily gain that's less than 1.2 in a dry lot scenario, it favors preg checking and fall culling. When you have an average daily gain in the winter of 1.5, that's your advantage of those additional pounds that you're putting on, and that then favors overwintering and selling in the spring. And so you can have a neighbor that's using a different management system, and he's going to be doing something different than you, maybe because of where he falls on this graph versus you. But even if you're both using swath grazing, your cows may be performing differently. They have different genetics, different weather, and therefore you may have different decisions of what's best for your operation depending on how your cows perform. So in general, this is numbers from the literature. We've got the dry lot mixed hay system with cost of production at $1.80 per cow per day. And this gives us the break even that we just saw on the graph of 1.2 pounds per day. And the average daily gain from the literature is 1.44. So this really favors selling in the spring. Whereas swath grazing, where you've got a cost of production at 1.22 per cow per day, and your break even is 0.7 pounds per day, you actually have a lower average daily gain in the literature, and this means that it really favors preg checking and selling in the fall. In bale grazing, even though it's your lowest cost of production at less than $1 a day, and it has a very low break-even average daily gain as a result, the literature shows that you can actually have quite good average daily gains of about 0.8 to 0.9, and this again encourages selling in the spring. So conclusion number 3, while you may have low feed costs, which make it look like it would be attractive to feed and sell in the spring, if your average daily gain is minimal, that offsets some of the advantage. And this is going to also come into effect of what is your goal in your winter feeding system. Is it to actually add pounds, or is it simply to maintain those cows? And if your goal is to simply maintain them, then you're not looking for some of these average daily gains, and selling in the spring may be what's best for your operation. The price of cows is a really big determinant of what you're going to do. And that consistently higher cow price in the spring has really discouraged preg checking over the last 10 years. Producers in Western Canada that have been overwintering their cows have received on average prices 25% higher in the spring than the previous fall from 2005 to 2014. And this is quite variable from as low as 6% back in 2006 to 53% in 2009. And producers have really not benefited from preg checking with these increases. But as you can see, there is a threshold point here at about $1.02 per pound. When if prices are lower than this, it actually encourages producers to preg check and cull in the fall. So last week, the Canfax average price for D1, D2 cows was $1 per pound. And that means we're right on that threshold of where it makes sense for producers to take a really hard look at their own costs to determine of what's going to make sense on their own operations. And that third alternative that I mentioned earlier is short-term feeding. And when we did a number of scenarios, the greatest economic benefit for producers was to preg check and feed the open cows as a separate group and market them at a later date. And the only case when separating cull cows was a less favorable option is when the overhead costs of separating them and feeding them separately was very high, or the number of days on feed was really low. And so this would be a situation where you're placing them on feed in late November and selling them in January, so 45-day period, selling them where prices had not to rally yet. Research in the US suggests that cows can gain anywhere from 2.5 to 3 pounds per day, and depends really on the length of the feeding period and the ration fed. But in order to increase that one quality grade that we said was really important for those thin cows, you want to be feeding cows at a minimum of 50 to 60 days, but not over 100 to 110 days. When you're going over that 110 days, and the rate of gain generally declines, as well as you have the risk of more obese cows with excess body condition, which can actually cause those cows to be discounted. And you remember, if you are feeding them in a confined feeding situation, that cull cows are going to need anywhere between 20 and 24 inches of bunk space and should be worked up onto that high energy ration, just like your cattle in the feedlot, to minimize metabolic disturbances. And you want these cows to be physically sound and healthy. But when they looked at gains, this could give you about $5 per head compared to overwintering over the 10-year period. So I mentioned that prices have peaked and are coming down. But not only that, last winter was the first time that we're in a bear run and cow prices actually dropped from the fall going into the spring. And so after having several years with these big year-over-year percent changes, we actually had a counter-seasonal year last year, and prices are dropping again. So I wanted to look at some scenarios of what does it look like when you've different pricing situations. And this graph looks at the gain or loss per head for preg checking, culling all open cows in October compared to overwintering them or having that short-term feeding period. And when you're seeing increasing prices like we have seen over the last 10 years, it's not surprising that you've got negatives. Sorry, you can't see me pointing. With increasing prices, preg checking is obviously a negative option, but in decreasing prices, overwintering or short-term feeding compared to preg checking, basically you've got declining prices encourage preg checking again because there are economic gains. It's in a constant price scenario, and the question then is, are we going to continue to see prices decline, or are we going to see prices stabilize over the next year? And if you're saying that prices are going to be stabilizing, then you've got a situation where short-term feeding may be discouraged, and you've got overwintering again that's negative. So the preg checking calculator is available at beefresearch.ca. You can go to resources and then decision-making tools, and the preg checking calculator is right at the top. There are two options: the basic model, which requires only 6 pieces of information, and it has all of the management systems that we discussed. And so the cost of production and the average daily gains are the numbers that we just talked about. The veterinary costs are from a survey done of 26 vet clinics in Alberta and Saskatchewan, with an average cost of about $4.75, which is really close to the numbers that Jessica mentioned at around $5 per head. In the advanced model, you can go in and you can actually put in all of your own cost situation. You can put in your cost of production, your average daily gain, your length of your winter feeding period, basically anything that changes, you can put it in and see what the results are. So I wanted to walk through just one example here, and I've put in a herd size of 200 head with a dry lot management system. So this is A, and the expected month for preg checking I have as September. So if you were going to do this over the next couple of weeks, with a calving month of March, and a full calf price. I did this a couple of weeks ago, so it's at 99 cents versus $1, which is really close, and that's for the beginning of September. We have an estimated open rate of around that 7.7%, so 15 culls. They would be marketed, we're saying, in December, with a market price of around 92 cents as we see those prices come down seasonally. I've got winter feeding costs of around $1.75, and so this is for that cull cows fed as a separate group. So you can plug in your own costs. We know that the dry lot that I've already picked is going to have winter feeding costs of about $1.78, so I've put in something very similar here. And I've got them on feed for 90 days, and I'm going to say that they're going to get slightly better average daily gain at 1.5 pounds per day compared to that dry lot scenario that we know is about 1.44. And here are the results. And so up here it shows you what your value is of the cow in September and in March, and the fact that you have a higher price in March, valued at about $1.72. Again, it gives you what the value is for that separately fed cow when you're selling her in December versus the value of your cow in March, because this is our comparison if you did nothing, and that's a difference of $1.49. So those prices are then shown in this graph on the left, but that's just the value of the cow. You still have to take into account what it's going to cost to feed her, and your vet costs, and your open rate. So we look here and it shows that your gain per head for preg checking and culling immediately versus not preg checking and just culling in the spring is $4. And what that means is you would gain an additional $1.73, but it's going to cost you about $1.76 to winter that cow. So if you sold her in the fall, you'd actually have a gain of $4, and on 200 head, that's going to give you a gain for your herd of about $850. And so this whole model is really set up with the premise that instead of minimizing costs, we want to maximize value for the producer. And in comparison, you've got that preg checking and feeding as a separate group actually being negative, so that would not be a good option if this was your situation. And I wanted to go back and see how the model worked historically, so I took those costs and I adjusted them, the cost of production for each year going back historically to 2005 based on our average hay prices in Alberta and fuel costs, and did a little scenario. And you can see back here in 2005 to 2008 that there are some years where it makes sense if you were in a dry lot and a swath grazing system, but it would not make sense if you were bale grazing. And we've got standing corn in here as well. But for several years in here, it really didn't make sense for preg checking, but that's really changed in the last 2 years, and we're back in a situation where it really does make sense to be preg checking again. And my final conclusion was that the cow value is often more important factor in economics of prey checking than either overwintering or veterinary costs. And as we come back into a price situation with lower kill cow prices, prey checking does make sense. So that's it, and I'll hand it back over to Stacy.
All right, thank you very much, Brenna. So with that, we will get started on the question and answer period of today. So if I can get all of my presenters to just turn on your webcam as well as your microphone, and we'll open it up to questions. So if you have any questions, please type them into the question box on the chat box on the side of your screen. If your control panel has closed, you should see an orange arrow near the top of your screen. If you click that arrow, it will expand again, and you'll be able to use the chat box to type your questions. So I will read them out, and we'll hear from either Reynold, Jessica, or Brenna. So we do have actually quite a few that have came in throughout the presentation here, so we'll get rolling, and while everybody else can start typing theirs in. So first, actually for Brenna, would you mind describing the difference between a bull and a bear market?
So as prices went up in 2014, that's considered a bull market, and I always think of it as a bull charges ahead. He's going uphill, versus a bear market is when the prices are coming down. And so since prices have peaked in May of 2015, prices are in a bear market as they're coming down, and think of a bear retreating back into the woods as prices go down.
All right, thank you. So once again, you can type your questions into the chat box on the side of your screen, and then I'll continue to read out some of the ones as they're coming in here. So the next one is for Jessica. For the blood test, does it require any special handling while you ship them? Does it have to be froze or shipped very quickly or anything like that?
Does not require any special ship on ice or any. It's not something that has to be kept at a specific temperature. You probably don't want the blood hanging out in the postal system for 3 weeks, but it doesn't have to be overnighted or anything like that. So as long as it's a relatively expedient trip, like a couple of days to the lab, that's plenty soon enough.
All right. So the next question here is for Reynold. So Reynold, how do you choose which projects are funded?
Well, it's a kind of an involved process. The first thing we do is we've got a national beef research strategy that's on our website. We developed it in 2012, and we are in the process of renewing it actually to update it based on what's been accomplished and what current industry issues are. So that's kind of the first thing, is the research proposal lined up with what our national strategy outlines. The second step in that process is to get the research proposals peer reviewed. And so what that's about is that we've got the producer council who ultimately decides what to fund, and they're really good producers, but they're not scientists. And you know, Brenna and me and Karen and at ABP and a few other, Andrea and a few others are really, really smart at a lot of things, but we're not specialists in everything, so we can't always judge whether the science in the proposal is sound. And so what we do is send those proposals out to unrelated experts in that field and get them to provide a confidential review of that proposal to say, okay, well, is it good science? Is it something new? Is it well laid out? Will it answer the question? That kind of thing. So then the council's job And our job is to look at all these things, take the ones that have kind of lousy peer reviews, put them off to the side, because if the science isn't good, we're not going to fund it. But the really tough part comes when we have a bunch of really good proposals that have really good reviews and that are all lined up with the strategy. We never have enough money to go around. So then it is where the producer council really comes in, and they get to make the really hard decision about which of these good proposals is going to make the biggest contribution to the industry. So hopefully that answers the question.
I think so. Our next question coming in is for Brenna. So can you find that calculator that you talked about during your presentation?
Right. So if you go to beefresearch.ca, so that's the BCRC website, and at the top bar, there's resources, and there's a little drop-down box there, and it's going to say decision-making tools. And there's a whole bunch of decision-making tools available on that website and on that webpage, but the very top one right now is the preg checking tool. And so when you click on that, you're going to scroll down, and it's going to give you the option to select either the basic or the advanced model. And then just like I showed you, you get to put in your information in the boxes.
All right, sounds good. So we have 2 more questions here, so if anybody else does have anything, make sure you type it in, because I'll read out those 2, and if not, we'll be done after that. So Jessica, this is coming, I'm assuming, from someone who's not a veterinarian, and they're asking if they could preg check their neighbor's cattle for a fee.
So that depends on the Practice Act in your particular area. So I know we have people registered from all across Canada, as well as some in the United States. So I can speak for Ontario. You cannot legally preg check your neighbor's cattle for a fee. It is illegal to do so because of the Practice Act. That is considered the diagnosis, making a diagnosis, and that is the purview only of veterinarians. And I think that's true across Canada, but I can't speak to each individual state. So you really would have to check your local area to determine if that is possible, but for the most part, probably not.
All right, thanks. And one last question here for you, Jessica. Can a blood test tell you the sex of the calf?
We do not currently have a blood test for cattle that will tell you the sex. It tells you pregnant or not pregnant, and that is it. So that's the full amount of the information that you get from the blood test. And so no, currently that is not an option, but there is more movement every day to getting blood tests as well as milk tests for dairy cattle to decrease the need to have rectal palpation. So that likely will come in the future, but right now, no, that's not an option.
All right, thanks. So it looks like that's all we have for questions tonight. So I just have a couple more things to tell you about before I let you go here. So the first is how to get more information and science-based production advice through the BCRC. You can go to our website that Brenna has mentioned already, beefresearch.ca, and click the subscribe button to sign up for our free email list. If you have a Twitter, Facebook, or a YouTube account, please follow along with us there as well. And I would also encourage you to visit the Canadian Cattlemen's Association website at cattle.ca, and you can sign up for their free newsletter called Action News. I wanted to let you know about our next BCRC webinar. It will be the Thursday, October 18th, and we'll be talking about managing pregnant cows for improved cow and calf performance, so be sure you don't miss out on that one. And very shortly, as soon as this webinar ends, you're going to be asked to complete a short survey that asks about tonight's session and what you're most interested in terms of future webinar topics. So we do need your feedback to do the best we can to deliver information that's both useful and meaningful to you and helps you make informed decisions on your operation. So please complete the survey for us, and don't hesitate to contact me with questions, comments, or suggestions at any time. You're also going to receive an email within a couple of days from me with a link to watch the recording, as well as links to some additional information on pregnancy detection as well. So that's it for the night. I want to thank all of you at home for joining us, and on behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank Reynold, Jessica, and Brenna for volunteering your time and expertise. So good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.